in this season you're in, are you developing a great appetite for God? The things of God, the word of God, the presence of God, the progress of God in your life, obedience to God, the development of your character to be more Christ-like. Is it something that is of great appetite for you? Or is it kind of like taking your medicine, right? You know, it's like, I could like a spoonful of sugar here helps the medicine go down. Like, I guess I'll freaking go back to church. Like, I guess I'll read the Bible. I suppose I should go on a prayer walk and talk to Jesus. Like, I guess I'll try fasting again. Like, is it an absolute like grind? Or are you at a place you're saying, you know what? I'm developing a really good appetite for God. Welcome back to the Daron Earlewine Podcast as we are walking chapter by chapter through my first book, The Death of a Dream, Resurrecting Purpose When Life Doesn't Go as Planned. Thanks so much for downloading this episode. It means so much. If you would, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, maybe even leave a review of the podcast, whether it be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is. That helps us grow the audience and make more of a difference in people's lives. So let's do that. I appreciate it. And let's jump in to chapter 14. Chapter 14. This one is it's a great chapter. I like this chapter. The weight of your calling is a little more serious. This is it's necessary. It's a completely necessary chapter in this book. It's a completely necessary chapter in your life if you're going to see God's purpose resurrected in your life. Because I've said this phrase before. It was life-changing when I first heard it, but the understanding of the pain of discipline as opposed to the pain of regret. Now, pain of discipline is what we're going to kind of look through here, understanding, developing the weight, your call, your character to be able to handle the weight of your calling is what this chapter is about. That happens through the pain of discipline. Life transformation, okay, because since we're not Jesus and there's quite a gap between where we currently are and where Jesus is character-wise, that gap, that process, that transformation does not happen automatically. It really doesn't happen, I wouldn't even say like easily, and it surely does not happen accidentally. It happens by making a decision to be a disciple of Jesus, and that means embracing discipline. And we're going to look at 4 character traits that need to be developed. I remember years ago, I was reading one of Erwine's books, which I read all of Erwine's books, and he talked about character development. And this was before I had even had kids. And he talked about these 4 elements of humility, courage, gratitude, and faithfulness. And how through working with the urban poor in Dallas for a decade, what he saw was the people that transformed their lives out of that environment, they had 4 character traits consistently, and these were them. And so I write about in the book that since my oldest son, Cole, was born, every night when I put my kids to bed and I pray for them, I've prayed for these 4 things, that they would grow to be leaders, to be men of humility, courage, gratitude, and faithfulness. And I will say God has, to this point, he has honored that prayer. And I see those 4 character traits in my sons, and I think it's laid a foundation for them to step into becoming who God's created them to be. And I want to see that for you as well. And so that's what we're talking about in this episode. And we just finished last episode, right, talking about woven, not wasted. And what I want to start the sentence I want to start off this session is that the weaving prepares you for the weight of your calling. The waiting and the weaving prepares you for the weight of your calling. And there's a sentence in the book where I say this, that God was at work in the meanwhile, just as he always is. God was at work in the meanwhile. And it makes me think about as a kid, like I think it was like the old school Batman TV show. Like, I mean, like really old school, like before most of any of you were probably born. Is they would, like, you know what I mean? And I think it was sometimes in like old comic books too, like in Superman and Batman comic books, like it would be like, meanwhile, like, you know, they would skip back to whatever, you know, meanwhile, back at the Batcave or whatever. And I think in Joseph's story that we walk through in the Bible, in the book and in the Bible, right, is there's for sure could be moments where like stuff's happening and all of a sudden it's like, and meanwhile, back at Potiphar's house, you know what I mean? Or it's like, meanwhile, back in the jail. And they could have gone back for Joseph because he was in jail for years for being falsely accused, right? Meanwhile, could have gone back and it would have been like, oh, still in jail, right? Hey, we're going to check in on God's dreams for Joseph's life. Meanwhile, still in jail. And it was in this meanwhile that God was at work. And you might be in a meanwhile season. You're like, man, I've got these dreams and aspirations. I feel like God's called me to this. I feel like this is what's going to happen. But meanwhile, I'm still working at Staples, right? Or meanwhile, I still have 3 jobs trying to figure out a way to make ends meet and what's going on, right? Like, I really feel like that God has called me to be a great dad or a great mom or to have kids and whatever it is and have a family. And meanwhile, I'm still on, I don't know what the dating app would be. Sorry, I should have had that one ready. Whatever it is. I had one that popped into my brain, but I can't remember if that's the one that's a little bit shade stern. I didn't want to throw that out there to record it. You know what I'm saying? You're in this meanwhile, and you're like, what is happening? Well, what is probably happening is God is at work in the meanwhile, developing and weaving together your character to handle the weight of your calling. That's why it's so good. What Jesus says right there in Matthew 5:6 starts off the chapter with this, right? You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink and the best meal you'll ever eat. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. That's a question I want to throw out for you right now is, in this season you're in, are you developing a great appetite for God? The things of God, the word of God, the presence of God, the progress of God in your life, obedience to God, the development of your character to be more Christ-like. Is it something that is of great appetite for you? Or is it kind of like taking your medicine, right? You know, it's like, I could, like a spoonful of sugar here helps the medicine go down. Like, I guess I'll freaking go back to church. Like, I guess I'll read the Bible. I suppose I should go on a prayer walk and talk to Jesus. Like, I guess I'll try fasting again. Like, is it an absolute, like, grind? Or are you at a place you're saying, you know what? I'm developing a really good appetite for God. If it is a grind, and right now it's like, no, it tastes like medicine. Ask God to begin to change your heart and your mind and draw you to himself. He loves to answer that prayer, right? So as we get into this in this meanwhile, I believe there are 4 character traits that God's going to develop in you and focus in on. Let's walk through them real quick. They're in the chapter of the book. First one is this: humility. In the book, I say this: it's very possible that it was his humility, speaking of Joseph, not his ability to interpret the dream that ultimately found Joseph in the position to which he was promoted. Now, if you're reading the chapter, you know we're talking about that Pharaoh has a dream where there's these cows and they come up on the beach and some of the cows eat the other cows. It's weird. No one knows what it means. But they go to Joseph because I want to steal a bit. In his faithfulness, right, people had realized that he was somebody who had this ability. He's able to come through. He interprets the dream, and it's what God uses as a defining moment in his life to set him up for great leadership and to step into the purpose of his life. But what I say here is it's very possible that it was his humility, not his ability, that set him up, okay? Humility reminds us that our dreams are never about us. I've heard it said that humility isn't necessarily thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Humility reminds us of who we really are, imperfect beings made from particles of earth who are also given access to the very Spirit of God to empower us to live as forces of good in this world. If you look at Joseph's life as he went through this, if he would have chosen bitterness, if he would have chosen self-protection, self-preservation, I don't think he is remembered as fondly by everyone who remembered him. Eventually the cupbearer to the king, and then they come back like, oh yeah, there was this dude, I forgot about him like 2 years ago. He was like a humble guy who like, he helped me God gave Joseph a supernatural ability to interpret this dream, but I think it was his humility that set him up for it. And I don't know, I would say humility may be one of the most endearing character traits that we could have. And you know that because when you're around someone who doesn't have any of it, you don't want to be around that person. And bottom line, your life is relationships. Everything else is just the details. So whatever purpose and whatever dream God's putting in your heart, relationships are going to be a massive part of it. And if you aren't growing in your humility, in a Christ-like attitude, as it would say in Philippians chapter 2, you're going to be in your own way often. Humility, though, is a weird one where God doesn't do it for us, right? Like we're actually commanded to do it ourselves, to humble ourselves. And I say this in the book, and I've said it before in my podcast, and I'll say it again right here, is if we do not choose to humble ourselves, life will eventually, and I would even add regularly, humiliate us. We got to step into humility. We have to choose it. One of the ways that we can choose to grow in humility is to think of others first and to serve other people. Take a look at your life. And in the meanwhile, in this space, in this waiting, do you have a regular outlet of serving other people, of putting other people first? If you do, you're going to be growing in humility. The next one is this: courage. On page 124, I say this: it may have been Joseph's humility that prepared him, but it was his courage that helped him seize the moment. Courage could also be understood as heart. It is often said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of faith. If you're going to seize each day as God prepared for you, like Joseph, you will need courage. Courage is interesting because oftentimes, and I say this in the book, is we think courage shows up when there's an absence of fear, or we wait to go out and actually step out in faith or obedience. I'm just waiting to be less afraid. Well, you're going to be waiting a long time. And you may be in a season right now where you're saying, I really want to see God awaken new purpose in my life, but I guess I'm in a season of waiting. And God may be saying, no, you're stuck on go. I've told you to go. Like I've been nudging you forward regularly, and you're not moving forward because you're scared. Like you're in a self-imposed season of waiting. It's not waiting. You're just stuck because you will not choose to become courageous. And this, you have to ask God for it. He'll give you the courage, but then you just got to go. You have to decide, I will step in faith into fear, even if it feels bad. If we're waiting for our fears to subside, we will wait forever because before we take a risk, before we obey, before we keep moving toward our calling, it's easy to think our fear will eventually subside. We can waste a lot of time fearing the outcomes of our decisions and never actually move forward. Fortunately, we're not called to manage outcomes. We don't have that kind of control. We're just called to obedience, which always requires courage. So often we come to a decision to move through a season, to move out of this meanwhile, out of this waiting, we get stuck and caught up in our own mind about outcomes, right? Like I know what I think I'm supposed to do, but my fear overwhelms me as I try to manage the outcomes. Well, I know I should forgive. I know I should ask her out. I know I should go back to school. I know I should try this. I know I should step into whatever it is. But what if this, and what if this, and then what if this, and if this happens, and what if this happens? And as you go through this whole what if games of the outcomes, you get overwhelmed with the myriad of possibilities that you usually probably interpret into their most negative consequence or possibility. Overcome by fear, anxiety, you shut it down, you don't move forward in courage. Once you know what you think God is nudging you to do, it's not time for you to sit around and manage all the potential outcomes of it. Your job is to obey, to go forward, to move. There are so many stories in the Old Testament, New Testament, where courage, a lack of courage, shuts down God moving people forward. One of the biggest ones I'm thinking about right now is as God sends the spies into the Promised Land, and they come back, and the majority of them are like, "Oh, it's so scary. There's giants, and there's the people occupying the land that God has promised to us, right? And we'll be overcome. It's terrible, right?" And Caleb comes back, and he's like, "No, like God said, let's do it. He'll show up. Let's go." Like, yes, the people that occupy the Promised Land, we will have to remove them. Yeah, there are some scary things there, but God's with us. We're going, right? You think about David, right? Little kid David shows up to the battle with Goliath, right? All the other dudes, their knees are shaking. They're scared. Oh my gosh, what's Goliath going to do? David's like, what's the deal, bro? Like, this guy comes at us with a sword and whatever. We come at him in the name of God. Like, God's on my side. Here we go. Give me a slingshot. I'll show you how we do it. See, fear is going to be one of the greatest enemies keeping you from stepping into God's purpose for your life. If you're growing in humility, it's time to be strong and courageous. Stop looking for every outcome of possibility. If you know what God's asking you to do, right? Answer these two questions every day. What's God asking me to do? What am I going to do about it? Once you answer the first question, it's go time. Let him figure out the outcomes. That's on him. Your job is to obey and to do it with great courage. How do you start that? Small. You start small. Find the smallest thing that you can say yes to and go do it, and go do it regularly. That builds the strength of your character and of your courage, and you become a person of great courage. Start small. Next thing is this. You got to grow in gratitude. It seems simple. You're like, gratitude, Darren, really saying thank you? That's a big deal in my life. It's actually a massive deal in your life. Gratitude is a pathway to joy and to wholeness. Without it, you will never see joy and experience in its fullness, and you will never become whole. I quote Erwin McManus all the time because I'm his protege. I love what he says, and he's changed my life with so much of his content. But I remember one day when he said this, that he said, no blessing, no matter how great, will ever penetrate a heart that is void of gratitude. I'm going to say that one again so you can write it down, right? No blessing, no matter how great, will penetrate a heart that is void of gratitude. And so if you're at a place where you've experienced the death of a dream, and you maybe you're like we talked about in the last session, right? This seems like a wasteland. Everything seems wasted. I got loose ends everywhere. I can't see it. I can't figure it out. I'm struggling to trust God. And God brings a blessing into your life. God brings something good into your life. But if you are not growing and regularly practicing gratitude in your life, God will be bringing the building blocks of your character, of your strength, of your purpose, and you will never receive them as gifts of God because you will not be able to actually see them with gratitude. For you, you'll feel like it was owed to you, or it could have been a little bit more, or is this really what's going to happen? I've seen this with people as they're trying to put careers back together. And they say, you know what, I want that. That's where I want to go. I want to be that kind of person. I want that kind of promotion. I want that kind of job. And God shows up and God gives them a job. And they go, whoa, what is this? This is garbage. Why would I want to do this? Is so below me. Maybe it is, or maybe there are certain times where you need to accept with gratitude the things that God's given you so that you can move into what he has for you in the future. Gratitude. It's key. Here's a cool thing. 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18 says this. Always be joyful. Never stop praying. Be thankful in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you who belong to Christ Jesus. This is beautiful. You're saying, Darren, I'm really seeking after God's will for my life. I've been reading the book, had a death of a dream, want to see my purpose resurrected. What is God's purpose for my life? What is God's will for my life, Darren? Be thankful in all circumstances. Gratitude. Gratitude is God's will for your life, and it's an amazing place to start. If you struggle with it, here's a tip for you, okay? If you struggle to be grateful right now, what I want to tell you to do is if you're struggling to be grateful for what you see in your life right now, look back. Look back and find the ways that God has been faithful to you up until this point and set the table for yourself to be able to understand and receive what's happening now with gratitude. So often when I begin to struggle with my trust and what God's doing and in the moments, I can look back and if I can get the momentum going for the gratitude for all the ways God has been faithful. It gets me into a head space and into a heart space, into a spirit space where I'm ready to step into the gratitude for the moment. This is another one where I say this: start small. You say, Daron, my life sucks right now. There's almost nothing that I can be grateful for. You know what I can be grateful for? Coffee, right? Every morning I wake up, guess what I do? I drink coffee. You want to know why? Because it's amazing. It's even good right now, okay? Start small. Coffee. Can you walk? Can you talk? Can you see? Can you listen to music? Do you have a car? Does it have windshield wipers? Like, can you hear a bird sing? Do you have a dog that likes you? Right? Did you make the mistake of buying a snake, but you think it may die soon? And you go, I'm just kidding. For snake people, it's cool if you want to have a snake. Find the most minuscule small things and start there every day, choosing gratitude. It's God's will for your life. In the meantime, we're growing, right? Developing a great appetite for God. Last one is this: faithfulness. Faithfulness. Faithfulness is simply doing what needs to be done, even when you don't feel like doing it. And it isn't really about just doing tasks. It's about being faithful to the people in your life. Joseph had been faithful to Potiphar, whether or not anyone realized that or believed him. And the reason the cupbearer remembered him was a testament to his faithfulness long before he stood before Pharaoh. He was faithful when no one noticed, but eventually his faithfulness was recognized. Joseph was faithful in every situation that we see him in, right? We can't miss that. He's betrayed by his brothers. He shows up in Potiphar, he's Potiphar's slave. What does he do? He shows up and he's faithful every day in what he's doing, and Potiphar puts him in charge of his whole household. Had Joseph been like, you know what, screw this, I'm the one wronged here, I'm the victim here, like, I'm not going to do this, you know what, I'm going to steal some money here, I'm going to cut a corner here, I'm not being faithful to this guy who bought me as a slave. No, he was faithful, God was with him, and he was elevated. Then he's wrongly accused, thrown in prison for years. What happens? God's with him even in the prison. He shows up and he faithfully serves in the prison, gets put in charge of what's going on in the prison. And notice the connection here. All of these are leadership opportunities that Joseph's being given. Why did he need leadership opportunities in a foreign land for himself? Oh, well, it's because God's purpose, the macro purpose of his life, was to lead a foreign country through difficult circumstances so that a famine would be missed, people would be saved, God's people would be saved, and eventually reconciliation and redemption would come to his own family. Well, guess what? 17-year-old, arrogant, right? I had a dream, bow down to me, I'm in charge kid. He couldn't handle the weight of the calling that God had on his life. But as he remained faithful, in the meanwhile, before you know it, a defining moment is opened up to him, and he steps into that moment with humility, courage, gratitude, and faithfulness, and God does what only God can do, and he resurrects his purpose. Faithfulness. This is starting small too. You say, Daron, you know what? I got a dream for my life. I want to be rich, okay? Are you faithful with the money you have now? Are you faithful to give back to God? Are you faithful to give back to him at least 10% of what he gives to you, right? Because God doesn't have any problem with you being rich, and maybe that's part of God's call in your life. But what he needs to know is, can I trust you with little? If I can trust you with little, then I can give you much. You know, when I really didn't feel like God's called me to be influential and to be significant in my leadership and lead something big. Okay, are you leading well in the small? In the smallest elements, relationships in your family. Are you leading well? Are you serving well in there? Are you faithful with little so he can give you much? Jesus says this in Luke chapter 16. He says this: if you are faithful in little things, you will be faithful in large ones. But if you're dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And if you're untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who would trust you with the true riches of heaven? And if you are not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with the things of your own? Luke 16:10-12, New Living Translation. Jesus is saying, listen, show yourself faithful. In the meanwhile, and you'll be ready to carry the weight of the calling that's coming for you. Here's really good news. I love this passage of scripture. Is God is actually looking for people that are developing a great appetite for him. Like, as you grow in this, in the meanwhile, you're putting yourself, like you're elevating yourself for God to see you because he's looking. Check the scripture out. In 2 Chronicles 16:9 in the New Living Translation, it says this: the eyes of the Lord search the whole earth in order to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Those whose hearts are fully committed, those who have worked up a great appetite for God, guess what? He is searching the whole earth. The eyes of the Lord searching the whole earth in order to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. In the meanwhile, this is where we grow, right? This is where we grow. I want to end it with a thought from page 127 on the book. But it says this: embrace character transformation as passionately as you pursue your dreams. When you do, the world will be more filled with faith, hope, and love. As a result, and you will be filled with them too. If you're in the meanwhile, if you're watching God weaving together your calling, he's preparing your character to handle the weight of your calling. Dig into it. Get yourself a nice big heaping plate of God. Develop a great appetite for him. You'll be glad you did. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Daron Earlewine Podcast. And until we talk again, remember these three things. God's for you, not against you. He's near you, not far from you. And he's created you on purpose and for a purpose. Talk to you guys next time.